I'll continue on. Okay, this PowerPoint slide, it's kind of like the third batch, and I'll cover this today and Friday. And here's what I'll cover right now: the adrenal gland, ovaries, testes. These slides go on to cover thyroid, parathyroid, and pancreas, but I won't get to that today. I'll teach the adrenal gland first. Now, in terms of where it is in the body, it's right on top of the kidneys, right there. So the adrenal gland is our stress response organ. It's also called the suprarenal gland because it's located superior to the kidneys. I more commonly call it adrenal gland. There it is, right on top of the kidney. It's not much to look at. However, if we cut it open, we can see what I mentioned yesterday. It's covered with a capsule. And there's an outer part that we refer to as the cortex, the inner part which we refer to as medulla. In terms of the physiology, the adrenal cortex, it secretes hormones called corticosteroids, which are utilized in the long-term stress response. Secretes corticosteroids. I'll go through them, one of which I've already mentioned, aldosterone. Those help in a long-term stress response. That will be over the time course of days, weeks, years. We call it the starvation death camp scenario. You're a prisoner of war, what you're subjugated to then. Or maybe you're stranded at sea, no food, no water. How long can you survive? Will you even try to survive? Okay, you're lost in the forest. And they're trying to find you for days. Will you survive? You're exposed to the elements. Those kinds of stresses on the body. And how does the body respond to keep you alive? So I'll teach you some of those secretions. Then we have adrenal medulla. And what I mentioned yesterday, those secrete epi-norepi, your catecholamines. Those act in a short-term stress response. Days, minutes, hours. Fight or flight response, correct? Get your heart pumping really quick. Like, running from a fire, or you're scared. Some situation where you're acting like frantically. That's considered a short-term stress response, a shorter time course. In terms of looking at these tissues under the microscope, this one I took a few years ago. It's not the best quality, as you can clearly see, but I did label it to help you. You're expected to be able to identify the capsule, the cortex, and the medulla. I won't ever ask you to identify the capsule, but you should know what it is because you don't want to misidentify part of the cortex by thinking it's the capsule. And that's really the key there. Can you identify, like for example, in this clearer picture, let me just tell you what it is. One is pointing to that inner part, medulla. There's a number 4 out here, this outer zone. What this teaches us is the cortex is divided into 3 zones. The outermost zone, where number 4 is zona glomerulosa. The middle zone, where number 3 is this kind of faded out zone in terms of the staining. That's zona fasciculata. And the innermost zone, right there, they have the number 2 there. That's called zona reticularis. So the cortex is zoned out, and I'll go through that. This slide will kind of puts the illustration of the histology next to a real image. Okay? And notice what they did. They're just taking a small piece, because kind of that's how you view it under the scope under a higher magnification, just a piece at a time. I think it's useful to look at this when you're learning it. Adrenal cortex. Know the 3 zones. Zona, glomerulosa. Look at that word root, glomer. It means ball of yarn. Knowing that, look at how the cells are arranged in that top zone. Underneath the capsule, the cells are arranged into these oval clumps, hence the name, balls of yarn. And you don't always see that. I would just remember it's the outermost zone. And in that zone, when it's stimulated by the ACTH, it'll secrete, well, there are a class of corticoids called mineral corticoids. So zona glomerulosa will secrete mineral corticoids. There's one you got to know. This is a class of steroid hormones. Mineral corticoids include, the only one you got to know, aldosterone. And what we had mentioned yesterday, when I used it as an example of a steroid hormone, is it facilitates sodium reabsorption. Okay? If you recall, I said this helps to increase the blood volume and blood pressure because water will follow that. And when you do that, well, basically in a stress response, you probably dehydrated, right? That could be one of the stressors on your body. So this will help maintain the blood pressure. That zone where the cells are arranged into vertical cords, like fascicles, that's called zona fasciculata. Now, zona fasciculata will secrete glucocorticoids. And there's only one you got to know: cortisol. It'll regulate blood glucose, and I'll tell you how later on. Let's finish the zones. The innermost zone that borders the medulla is zona reticularis. Anything that's called reticular in A&P, it means dense, complex network. So the cells are arranged in some haphazard manner. So all of these kind of describe, the names of the zones describe how the cells are arranged in histology. You know, look at them under the scope. And you got to know the secretions. The zona reticularis will secrete the sex hormones. Most of the sex hormones come from the gonads, but there's a little bit from the adrenal cortex. And I already mentioned what the adrenal medulla secretes, epi, norepi, that's it. There's an easy memory jogger to help you remember what the zones do, what their secretions do. Salt, sugar, sex. Salt, because of the aldosterone. Sugar, you regulate the glucose and the sex hormones from zona reticularis. So a quick memory jogger for that. And so I just kind of have that listed here on the slide. I don't need to rewrite it. Salt, sugar, sex, just remember that. The following slide is a complex cascade of things, and the only thing I really want you to understand is that all of these sex hormones and glucocorticoids, mineral corticoids, they're all derived from cholesterol. Okay? I'll probably mention this later, maybe I should just point it out now. There is one sex difference between the biological sexes, male and female, and that is the activity of one enzyme, aromatase. Here are the male hormones, androstenedione and testosterone. They're converted to estradiol and estrone via aromatase. Okay, so I'll mention that again later, so that might be one thing to circle if you got the slide printed out. Now, to kind of present the the physiology of each zone, your book kind of emphasizes different things, and I would like to emphasize for the zona glomerulosa how aldosterone works to maintain or increase blood pressure. And in particular, we did mention that yesterday, but today I would like to talk about how you can stimulate its release. Okay, there's different ways. And there's one way you can inhibit its release. So if you can remember that you're trying to maintain blood pressure, if your blood pressure is dropping, you need aldosterone. If your blood pressure is too high, you don't need it, right? So you can inhibit it. And you have a figure in your book that'll help you study that. There's 3 mechanisms of its release and 1 mechanism of inhibition. So let me just kind of get them up here. All of the arrows are pointing to the zona glomerulosa, where aldosterone is released from. Aldosterone release. Okay, the first thing I've listed there, this RAS mechanism, R-A-A-S. I'll talk about that on the next couple of slides. Just know now that it's a cascade of events. Eventually, you'll get to this molecule called angiotensin II that has a direct action to release aldosterone from here. But I'll go through that cascade, and you are responsible for that. Another way you can act on the zona glomerulosa is low sodium. Maybe you're dehydrated, you've lost electrolytes in your stressful situation. Low sodium is a direct effect. That's indicated here. Direct effect on the zona glomerulosa. The stress will trigger the brain to release ACTH. ACTH, again, can directly act on zona glomerulosa. So I'll just put ACTH. All of these will increase aldosterone. Again, the one way you can inhibit it, I'll just put AMP, it's written out on the slide, atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay. If blood pressure is too high and you want to lower it, that can help. It would do so by decreasing aldosterone. So this one, this RAS mechanism, if you study the next couple slides, there's this slide that kind of indicates, my battery's wearing out in here, hold on. There's a bunch of different molecules in this cascade. This slide I inserted to try to make sense of what these do. There's molecules that are cleaved, and in molecular biology, a lot of times you cleave molecules, and that kind of makes them into a more active form. So I'll kind of mention those as we go along. And so the whole cascade you're responsible for is on this slide. And it's numbered to help us take it through it because there's a lot of steps here. But to kind of take a big picture view of this slide, think about what we're trying to do. We're under a stressful situation. You may be dehydrated. You may have lost electrolytes like sodium. You may have lost blood volume. You may have decreased blood pressure, and that's what you're trying to correct. So in the end, we're going to show you how blood pressure can return to normal. That's what we're going for here. So this is number 1. So this RAAS mechanism, it's a mechanism to increase blood pressure. I'll never forget when I interviewed for a job, they made me do this. I didn't know they were going to ask me. They just kind of threw it on me. It's long, okay? I think I got most of it. I know it very well now, after having taught it for many years. I'll tell you this much. Okay, let's number the way they do. I think they do a very good job of presenting it. You got the first three steps there, and they're just telling you what the stressor is. Dehydration, low sodium, then you got decreased blood volume, decreased blood pressure. Dehydration, I'll just put that one. Dehydration leads to decreased BV, blood volume, decreased BP, blood pressure, and that's the trigger, okay? Because then number 4, the kidneys have a mechanism to detect a drop in blood pressure for the whole body. The kidneys are responsible for fluid balance. They're producing urine output. And when the kidneys sense this drop in blood pressure, they'll release renin. That's the first R. Renin will increase in the circulation. Okay. Now, once you get to number 4, and you have your increase in renin, which is number 5 on that figure, the liver is secreting this molecule called angiotensinogen. There's liver, so they're going to number 6, and it's going to secrete a molecule called angiotensinogen. It's an inactive molecule. Renin is a cleaver. So I'm going to put the word cleaves. It's going to cleave it into a molecule called angiotensin 1, number 7. I'll just abbreviate it ANG1 for short. Okay? That molecule also needs to be cleaved again. It travels to the lung capillaries. For number 7, we're going to go to number 8. Lungs. The lungs have a molecule called ACE, A-C-E, which stands for, I'll write it up here. ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin converting enzyme will convert ANG1 into ANG2. Angiotensin 2. And that's the key here. This molecule has the ability to increase the blood pressure. Got it. So when you get to this step, actually that's step 9, not step 8. Sorry, I have 2 8s. Let's pause and look at the previous slide. Renin cleaved angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Then ACE just chopped off a little bit more, and you get angiotensin 2. And this is the molecule where we're going to pick it up. Okay? So renin and ACE, they're just cleavers. That's what I wanted to say. When we go back, we can see that to finish off here, angiotensin 2, we're going to do a couple of things. One is it'll act on the adrenal cortex. Call that number 10. It's the ZONA glomerulosa. That's what I'll put. It acts on ZONA glomerulosa. That's kind of where we're at. So that'll increase the aldosterone level. Aldosterone is a hormone That when secreted, like I mentioned yesterday, it targets the kidney. And what we had said yesterday, when you get that sodium reabsorption, water will follow. Okay. Increased sodium reabsorption. When water follows, number 13, from number 12 up to number 13, that increases the blood volume. BV for short. When you increase the blood volume, you increase the blood pressure. They label that number 14. So BP, either maintain it or increase it, okay, in a stressful situation. If you're losing, if you're hemorrhaging, you're probably just trying to maintain blood pressure, or you're increasing it over time if you're dehydrated. But the other thing that angiotensin can do, angiotensin 2 can do, it can vasoconstrict arterioles. They call that number 15. When you vasoconstrict arterioles, you're clamping down. When you clamp down on the smallest arteries, you keep more blood in the arterial system. That'll help keep blood pressure up so that blood can continue to flow to vital organs. And that's the key physiology there. So both of those, whether you increase the blood volume or just kind of clamp down and close off the smaller arteries, you're helping to boost the blood pressure. That's why angiotensin 2 is very important. Think of this as two different ways to increase blood pressure. This and that right there. So you're responsible to know that cascade. Is there any questions about that series of steps? Yeah?
What's happening after step 14?
Step 14 is done. You're done at step 14.
Oh.
Step 15, I don't like that they numbered it 15. It doesn't come after. It's like 13 and 15 both do 14. Two different ways to increase blood pressure. Yeah.
So ACE is in the lung?
Yeah, it's an enzyme that works in the lung capillaries. That is correct. I've thought about that. Why is it the lungs? When you breathe the air, compared to your core body temperature, air is colder, right? Enzymes work better at different temperatures. Maybe they work better at colder temperatures. So maybe that enzyme is better active in the lungs. Any other questions about ACE? Well, to get you thinking about drugs you may give to your patients, there's a class of drugs called ACE inhibitors, and let me just kind of get it all in here. Let me just ask you this. You can read the slide yourself. Okay, you don't have to memorize this, but let's look at our flow chart. You got ACE. It gives you your angiotensin 2. What if you have a patient who's hypertense? Their blood pressure is greater than 140/90 for whatever reason. And you want to help them by prescribing an ACE inhibitor. Well, what does it do? What if you get rid of that? What's the effect on ANG2? Up or down? Down. You're going to decrease the levels. And if you decrease the levels, ultimately, what's the effect on blood pressure? It goes down. Okay, that's the only thing I really wanted you to get. If you know what ACE does, then what does an ACE inhibiting drug do? All right, to move on, that was ZONA glomerulosa. That was aldosterone. Okay, ZONA fasciculata. That's the sugar of the salt sugar sex thing. So I do want you to know cortisol. Okay, I did mention that. Here's a slide of its effects. Well, we know it's released in response to stress and ACTH. I would write this down. This is the main physiological effect of cortisol. Gluconeogenesis. Let's compare that to glycogenolysis. They both increase glucose levels. However, this one, the key thing is you're creating new glucose. You're creating glucose from fat and protein. You're creating carb from non-carb sources in a stress response situation. Form new glucose from fat and protein. So basically, why is this a stress response situation? When you do this, you're sparing glycogen. Glycogen is your main carb source. It's how all animals store sugar in their bodies. Spare glycogen. Because the brain, the vital organ of the brain, basically it can only utilize glucose for fuel. Fat and protein can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So by sparing glycogen, it's like you're saving it. Okay, it's like you're literally your savings, your money. You got checking, you got savings. I don't know about you, whatever money in my checking account, I drain that real quick. I got savings. I don't want to touch that ever, right? You want to save that. It's there. It's money I can spend, but I don't want to, unless there's some kind of emergency. Maybe I'm saving for something. Okay. Now the body's the same way about glycogen. If you're like trapped on a life raft for weeks, maybe you got water, but okay, well, what are you going to do? Oh, you have to spare your glycogen. Don't spend it unless you have to. Okay. So by burning your fat and protein to make glucose, it's like you're putting money in your checking account, so you don't have to spend your savings account. You're sparing it. So your book says you spare glycogen. They also say things like you save glucose for the brain by doing this. Okay. All right, so compare that to glycogenolysis. Well, here you just break down glycogen to increase the glucose. You're just breaking down your carb store. So you got hormones that do both. Cortisol, the prime thing, gluconeogenesis. So you have pictures in your book. They're not meant for me to teach from, but I thought it would be good to kind of just show them to summarize what we've been talking about here about a stress response organ. So man running from fire, all right? So that's the scenario, and had a lot of those last November. Increased heart rate and blood pressure. You're going to dilate the bronchioles. Glucose is elevated, okay? This is epi and norepi being pumped into your bloodstream. So this is good physiology to review for the short-term stress response. There's the adrenal medulla being directly stimulated by a nerve. Remember I taught that last time? A direct neural stimulation. So it comes from, everything comes from the brain. This is the sympathetic nervous system. There's the physiology effects. But over a longer period of time, they give the example of a man, he's got nowhere to go. Okay, he's on the streets, he's somewhere. And he has no shelter, he's exposed to the elements, and maybe he doesn't have good sustenance. And so the body responds with ACTH. Maybe it's weeks, maybe it's months, who knows? There's glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids, so we talked about the effects of cortisol, I just did that. And then mineralocorticoids, they show kidneys because I talked about, well, mostly aldosterone, okay? It can affect the kidney to help you boost the blood pressure. The zona reticularis really isn't discussed in a stress response. They do secrete the sex hormones, but I'm not going to ask you about the sex hormones in regards to zona reticularis. They may contribute to the onset of puberty, but don't worry about it, okay? Now, I put some practice questions for the interest of time. How about I just give you the answers, you take note, and as you're reviewing later on today or tomorrow, quiz yourself. Which of the following is not a stimulus of aldosterone release? So it's the thing where it's is not. Okay, so let me look at this. A stress response that raises. Oh, I'll do it. That's good. That's not good. That's good. That's good. B is the answer. Okay, number 2. Which of the following is not an adrenal cortex solution? So again, it's the is not thing. Is not an adrenal cortex. Okay, that is not. D is not. So then, okay, E is not either. D is the correct answer. Only D is not from the cortex. It's from the medulla. Renin is released in response to A, low blood pressure. And then the RAS mechanism, which does not participate. That does. They all participate, so E is correct. So study this. When you think you've mastered it, try to answer those questions. They should be simple if you've got it down. Okay? But we'll move away from adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla, for that matter, and we'll go on to ovaries. Okay, shifting gears. Well, we got ovaries and testes. We'll do ovaries first. These are the gonads that make the sperm and the eggs for reproduction. But we talk about them here because of their endocrine function. Estrogen and testosterone secretion. So if you just look at the whole female reproductive tract, there's the ovary. And we're going to look at the follicles inside there that secrete the estrogens and estradiols. Well, those are the estrogen hormones. If you were to look at this illustration, what you see here, they're illustrating to you a typical 28-day menstrual cycle in a sexually mature female. And I want to teach you the follicle development all the way up to, well, here. Okay. But basically what happens is every 28 days, in the ovary, a cohort of about 20 follicles will be selected to mature. And the more mature follicles will secrete the estrogen. Okay? One will achieve dominance and ovulate its egg, which may or may not be fertilized that month. Okay? All right, so to kind of like give you the whole picture, ovary. We're talking about follicular development. In physiology, follicle means, I always think of a jelly donut. I expect there to be jelly on the inside, and if there's not, I'll be very disappointed. Okay, and this is what a follicle is. There's cells that surround something on the inside. In this case, it's the egg. Now, I don't like the term egg, but it's useful. People know what I mean when I say by it. It's the one cell that's got half the DNA of the female. The other half will be provided by the sperm. Okay, sperm fertilizes eggs. Well, the real word for that, the cells that become eggs, are oogonium. In the ovary, during pregnancy, before a female is even born, what's happening is you don't have follicles yet, but the oogonium, they undergo mitosis during pregnancy. Oogonium undergo Mitosis, which is, regular cell division. One cell becomes two. Two cells become four. Four cells become eight. Cell division. Now, in the 7th month of pregnancy, you get follicles that form around the eggs. So around the 7th month, you get follicle formation. So let's take an egg with the nucleus. It's got half the DNA in it. Let's put a wall of cells around it. A wall of squamous cells. So it's one big cell in the middle, surrounded by flat cells. We would call this a primordial follicle. Primordial follicle. It's an immature follicle. Primordial follicle. They're very small. So let's go from 7th month pregnancy to birth. Newborn baby girl. You're going to have about 1 to 2 million of these primordial follicles. But these are not secreting estrogen because obviously a newborn baby girl is not sexually mature. Sexual maturity, when puberty hits, on average is about 12 and a half years. So let's skip from birth to 12 and a half years. In all that time, you are not increasing the number of follicles because once you put a wall of cells around a cell, it can't divide. So however much you're born with, about 1 million, that's how much you got throughout your whole life. For whoever it is. There's some attrition. By the time you get to puberty, maybe you're down to 400,000 primordial follicles. Puberty, 12.5 years for a female. 400,000 primordial follicles. And from the very first cycle, I just went through this, I have a 13-year-old daughter, she just started, and you start selecting from that bank of 400,000. You'll select about a cohort of about 20 to develop more. The more mature follicles will secrete the estrogens. One will achieve dominance and ovulate every month from puberty to menopause, which is about age 50.5 years. Pretty much you're depleted. The ovary is depleted of the oocytes. So each cycle, each menstrual cycle, which is about 28 days, select your 20 to undergo further maturation. So we call this follicular development. Select 20 to undergo further maturation. And so I know this is starting to sound like a repro lecture, but it's not. Let's remember the hormone that targets the ovary. It's FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, it's from the anterior pituitary. So under FSH influence, one thing will happen, you'll get that primordial follicle and turn it into a primary follicle, which is a single oogonium, or now you start to call them oocyte. Okay, that's the term that's used. Oocyte. Egg is the lay term. From oogonium, once you start to get the follicle development, call them oocytes. One of my favorite words, like the oo, okay? Oocyte, one cell surrounded by one layer of cuboidal cells. this is still considered not mature. This immature follicle will not secrete estrogen, but that's kind of like the next stage of development after primordial. Okay. As they get bigger and bigger, what happens is you're going to proliferate these cells on the outside, these individual follicle cells. And when you progress from primary to secondary, let me label this primary follicle. When you progress from that to secondary, this is when you first see the structures that can secrete the hormones. Okay, you still got the egg inside. Other things you might notice that weren't there before, though, you have these little pockets of fluid that surround the egg. You have many layers of cells. It gets kind of hard to draw, but I'll just kind of sketch kind of sort of what we're going to see. Get a lot of cells. They call it a stratification of the granulosa cell. So basically, all the cells that surround the one cell, the egg, are called granulosa cells. What I drew in purple. Those cells are surrounded by these fibrous-looking cells called thecal cells. I'll just kind of draw them as blue lines. Theca. These are what you see in the more mature follicles. So here's how the estrogen is secreted. It's a process. Thecal cells, they'll actually secrete a male hormone. For example, androstenedione. Androstenedione secreted by the thecal cells will be transferred to the granulosa cells. Under the influence of FSH, you're going to boost the activity of aromatase. So I'll put under FSH influence, increase aromatase activity. So what you're going to do is you're going to convert the androstenedione, a male hormone, to a female sex hormone, estrone. What are the estrogens? And it's the aromatase activity that facilitates that transformation. I did mention that earlier. I mentioned that I would mention it later, and this is it. This is the later. And so that's why it's important to mention the theca and the granulosa cells. They're doing that cellular physiology. So this is how you get estrogen into the bloodstream for the female. The more mature follicles tend to be pushed towards the middle part, the medulla part of the ovary. The outer part's got the more immature follicles. Of the 20 that reach secondary, one will achieve dominance and become Graphian, the largest one. The Graphian, I'm erasing it, they also have spica and granulosa cells, but only one achieves dominance, probably the one with the most FSH receptors. Sometimes Graphian follicles are called vesicular follicles, but there's a picture of it. I won't try to draw it. It's even larger. It's ready to burst. It's like a bubble ready to burst. And when you do ovulate, I'll talk about that more later. But this is also secreting even more estrogens into the body. Okay. I'll just put Graphian follicle there, the largest. For histology purposes and identifying these things, can you do it? Well, let me get my point. What do you think number one is in terms of primordial, primary, secondary, Graphian? What do you think? Number one. Number one is over here. It's all these small ones in the outer cortex. Primordial, very good. What about number two? This one's a little bigger. I see cuboidal cells surrounding an egg. Primary. This three. That three, they're all secondary. I see an egg in the middle. I see cells, I see pockets of fluid. I see more cells. This big boy right here, number 4, or I should say big girl, Graphian follicle. There's the egg, big moon-shaped antrum, okay? I kind of zoomed in just a little bit, and I tried to label for you theca and granulosa cells. There and there. Okay. Theca, granulosa. So that's ovaries, and testes, it's a little easy to grasp. The testes are shown here, and they're cut open, so that you can see the structure that produces the sperm, the seminiferous tubule. Okay. Okay, before I do the male gonad, any questions on ovary? Yeah.
Just a quick quiz question. With the histology, will you be using what you just showed us in here, or is it in the histology book?
Question was asked what I'm going to use for the quiz, right? What I'm going to do is, I got slides over there,
Okay.
and I'm going to take pictures of them, and I'm going to present them, and I'll post it on Canvas today, and I'll use those for the quiz. Okay? Did anyone have Professor Slutsky for 4:30? Anybody? Not one person? Okay. Well, he uses a scope camera too. I was just wondering. Was there a handout? Yes.
So what is the fluid that's in the secondary?
Good question. I don't even know. It's just fluid. It's like the egg is like pushing all these cells away from itself, and it creates pockets of fluid. I don't know exactly what it is. Yeah. Any other questions about ovaries? Okay. Testes. So what you got there, you got this kind of compartmentalized structure. All these little apartments or partitions inside a testes, and inside there you have these long convoluted tubes called the seminiferous tubule. What I drew in blue, seminiferous tubule. If you cut it and mount it on a slide and look at it, you're going to see a bunch of cut tubes. Okay, so that's kind of what you're looking at there, a bunch of cut tubes. That's where the spermatogenesis occurs. So formation of sperm. Got a lecture on that later on, not for this test. That's upcoming next Wednesday. But this right here is what you need to identify for endocrine. The interstitial cells of Leydig, they secrete testosterone. They're outside the seminiferous tubule. Okay? So anything that would be visualized outside. And you have like a little cluster of cells outside the tube. Interstitial cells. I'll put in parentheses of Leydig, because that's an older term I still like to use, but usually books are dropping the of Leydig and just call it interstitial cells. Either is acceptable. So to get you ready for the histology quiz, I'll pick it up on here on Friday. I'll teach thyroid and parathyroid. And I think I could get through all the histology, so you're ready for Friday now. And on Canvas, there was a list of things that I may ask you for the quiz on Friday. And I got it here. If you need a copy, I'll leave it right by the door. You can help yourself. It is on Canvas. And we're done with the half sheet, so why don't you do me a favor? Come get this if you need it, but leave your half sheet right here. Basically, let's take a 5-minute stretch break. I got to get my slides together. And then I'll present the histology slides. Yeah.